In the ancient halls where power had been measured by submission for countless generations, where the strong ruled through dominance, and the weak survived through acceptance of chains that bound both body and spirit, a moment would come that challenged every assumption about authority, freedom, and the true nature of bonds that connected souls across lines of pack law and royal decree. The great hall of the Black Vein stronghold had witnessed coronations and conquests, declarations of war and treaties of peace, but never had its stone walls echoed with words that would reshape the foundation of power itself. Here, where tradition demanded obedience and hierarchy, required sacrifice of individual will for collective stability, an Omega girl would speak truth that kings had forgotten, and chains that had been forged through centuries of systematic oppression would face challenge from courage that refused compromise with injustice. Naira Vale stood before throne that commanded respect through fear, rather than earning loyalty through wisdom, her slight frame bearing dignity that no amount of intimidation could diminish, despite circumstances that had brought her to moment, where survival itself depended upon choice between freedom and safety, between authentic existence and comfortable slavery that pack tradition offered to those willing to surrender personal autonomy for protection and belonging. The bonds that would bind her were not mere political convenience or social tradition, but mystical connections that alpha dominance required from Omega compliance through sacred laws that governed pack relationships according to principles that served stability through systematic suppression of individual will and natural rebellion against injustice that threatened established order. But Naira Vale had learned through 18 years of careful observation and painful experience that stability built upon oppression served those who benefited from injustice, rather than creating genuine harmony that honored both strength and gentleness, leadership and independence, protection and freedom that authentic relationships required for serving souls, rather than merely controlling bodies. Through systematic intimidation and spiritual manipulation, King Therion Blackvein ruled from throne that his ancestors had claimed through conquest rather than consent, his authority maintained through traditions that emphasized dominance over cooperation while demanding submission from those whose strength took forms that conventional wisdom failed to recognize or appreciate. Yet beneath royal bearing that commanded obedience through power, rather than inspiring loyalty through character, lay questions about justice and responsibility that traditional authority could not answer through conventional means. The ceremony that would bind Omega to Alpha, through sacred laws governing pack relationships, represented culmination of social system that measured worth through compliance and strength, through ability to dominate rather than protect, serve, or inspire others toward growth, that honored individual dignity while maintaining collective welfare through cooperation rather than coercion. As ritual preparations continued, according to ancient customs that transformed personal choice into political necessity, through mystical bonds that could not be broken once established, through sacred vows, witnessed by powers that ensured compliance with traditional obligations regardless of individual feelings about justice or personal autonomy, tension built toward moment that would either established order, or reveal that alternative approaches to authority might serve pack welfare more effectively than systematic oppression disguised as protection. The Omega girl who stood before Alpha King carried within her spirit that had never been broken, despite circumstances that challenged every assumption about survival and resistance to injustice, that served powerful interests through systematic denial of individual worth and personal freedom, that authentic existence required for souls to flourish, rather than merely endure through careful accommodation, tie into others' convenience and traditional expectations. Her choice would force revelation of truth about bonds that governed pack relationships, whether they served genuine connection between souls that honored both strength and vulnerability, or represented elaborate system for ensuring compliance through mystical coercion that transformed love into obligation and partnership into ownership that protected powerful, while sacrificing vulnerable to maintenance of stability that served injustice rather than authentic community welfare. The Alpha King would face decision that challenged every assumption about royal authority and traditional leadership when Omega refused bonds that pack law demanded through sacred ceremony designed to ensure submission to established hierarchy. His response would either confirm that power sought dominance over cooperation, or reveal that true strength could choose justice over convenience, despite political consequences that such choice might create for traditional authority structures. In Great Hall, where echoes of ancient ceremonies emphasized continuity with past that had never questioned foundations of power or examined assumptions about natural hierarchy that justified systematic oppression through claims about cosmic order and inevitable submission, words would be spoken that challenged everything Pack tradition had taught about relationships between strength and gentleness. Authority and freedom, protection and independence that souls required for authentic existence rather than comfortable slavery. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The ceremony chamber filled with witnesses whose presence emphasized political significance of ritual that would bind Nira Vale to sacred obligations through mystical bonds that Pack tradition invested with supernatural authority to ensure permanent submission to alpha dominance regardless of personal feelings about justice, compatibility, or individual autonomy that authentic relationships require. Read for serving souls rather than controlling bodies through spiritual manipulation. Elder Marcus stepped forward, carrying ancient tome, whose words had bound countless Omegas to lives of careful obedience through sacred laws that transformed personal choice into mystical necessity while protecting established hierarchy through supernatural enforcement of traditional power relationships that served alpha interests rather than genuine community welfare or individual dignity that Jiu Stice demanded. Nira Vale, the elder announced with voice that carried weight of centuries of similar ceremonies that had confirmed Pack order through systematic binding of potential resistance to established authority. You stand before Alpha King Therian Blackvein to accept sacred bond that will unite your spirit to royal service through mystical connection that serves Pack stability and territorial welfare, through your submission to divine authority that rules through cosmic law. I understand the nature of ceremony, Nira replied, with voice that carried steady clarity, despite circumstances that made resistance dangerous, while submission represented betrayal of everything she believed about personal worth and individual freedom, that no amount of tradition could justify sacrificing for others' convenience or political stability. Then you accept mystical binding that will connect your Omega nature to Alpha authority through sacred laws that ensure harmony through submission to natural hierarchy, that serves Pack welfare through established order, that protects all members through appropriate recognition of cosmic roles that govern relationships between strength and gentleness. I do not accept such binding, Nira declared, with words that sent shock rippling through chamber, where tradition had never been challenged through direct refusal of sacred ceremony that Pack law considered essential for maintaining stability through supernatural enforcement of hierarchical relationships. Do not accept? Elder Marcus repeated, with voice that struggled to process rejection, that challenged assumptions about Omega compliance, with sacred obligations that had never been questioned through generations of similar ceremonies that confirmed established order through mystical bonds that could not be refused without threatening Pack Foundation. I choose exile over chains, Nira stated with conviction, that transformed individual resistance into declaration of principles that challenged every assumption about natural hierarchy and inevitable submission through ceremonies that served powerful interests rather than authentic community welfare or spiritual growth that honored both strength and vulnerability equally. Silence filled chamber like physical weight, as witnesses processed words that defied tradition so fundamental that rejection seemed impossible, according to Pack laws that governed relationships through mystical bonds, designed to prevent exactly such rebellion against established order that maintained stability through systematic suppression of individual will and natural dignity. From throne that commanded attention through authority rather than inspiring respect through character, Alpha King Therian Blackvein studied Omega, whose courage had challenged everything his reign represented, while revealing questions about justice and responsibility that conventional power could not answer through traditional means or establish protocol that protected hierarchy rather than serving authentic community needs. You choose exile over sacred bond that would provide protection, elevation, and spiritual connection that serves both individual welfare and Pack stability through mystical unity that honors cosmic order? He asked with voice that carried curiosity rather than anger, despite challenge to royal authority that threatened established system through rejection of fundamental ceremony. I choose freedom over comfortable slavery, authenticity over convenient submission, dignity over protection that requires surrender of everything that makes existence worth preserving through struggle, rather than accepting chains that transform souls into property for others' benefit and convenience. And you understand that exile represents death sentence for Omega alone in wilderness, without pack protection or territorial authority, to ensure survival against enemies that threaten all who venture beyond established boundaries without adequate defense? I understand that death with dignity serves soul better than life without freedom, while exile that preserves authentic existence honors spirit more than comfortable imprisonment, disguised as elevation through mystical bonds that transform love into obligation and partnership into ownership that protects powerful while sacrificing vulnerable. Her words carried philosophical framework that challenged fundamental assumptions about pack relationships and individual worth, while revealing understanding of cosmic principles that conventional authority failed to recognize through systematic focus on control rather than cooperation, dominance rather than service, tradition rather than justice that authentic leadership required. King Therion rose from throne with movement that commanded immediate attention throughout chamber, where witnesses expected royal rage and harsh punishment for unprecedented defiance of sacred ceremony that pack tradition considered essential for maintaining stability through supernatural enforcement of hierarchical relationships that served established order rather than individual dignity. "Captain Sterling," the king commanded with voice that carried absolute authority, despite words that would shock court more than Omega's rebellion had, through challenge to everything they understood about royal power and traditional obligation to maintain established order through systematic enforcement of hierarchical relationships. "Your Majesty," Captain Sterling replied with automatic obedience, despite obvious confusion about royal intentions following unprecedented challenge to sacred ceremony. That tradition demanded be enforced through harsh punishment for defiance that threatened pack foundation through rejection of mystical bonds. "Prepare escort for immediate departure toward territorial boundaries," King Therion declared, with decision that sent new shock through chamber, where witnesses struggled to understand royal response that seemed to accept exile rather than punish rebellion through conventional means that protected established authority. "Your Majesty requests escort for the exile?" Captain Sterling asked with voice that carried disbelief about royal decision that appeared to facilitate rather than prevent departure that would remove potential threat while confirming Omega's choice through practical accommodation rather than punishment. "Prepare escort for 2, the king corrected with words that transformed understanding of situation, while revealing decision that challenged every assumption about royal authority and traditional obligation to maintain established order through systematic enforcement of hierarchical relationships that served pack stability rather than individual justice. 2, Your Majesty?" Captain Sterling's voice carried shock that reflected confusion throughout chamber, where witnesses processed implications of royal statement that suggested participation in exile rather than merely facilitating Omega's departure from pack territory and established authority. 2, King Therion confirmed, while removing crown that symbolized royal authority and setting it carefully upon throne that had commanded respect through power rather than earning loyalty through wisdom or justice, that authentic leadership required for serving community welfare rather than merely maintaining traditional hierarchy. "Your Majesty, surely you cannot mean..." Elder Marcus began with voice that struggled to process royal decision that threatened everything pack tradition understood about necessary authority and cosmic order that required alpha dominance through established hierarchy. "I invoke the ancient law of bound choice," King Therion declared, with words that sent final shock through chamber, where witnesses realized royal decision would challenge foundations of power itself through application of forgotten legal principle that had been buried beneath centuries of systematic oppression disguised as natural law. The ancient law had been created during formation of pack territories when leadership served community welfare through cooperation, rather than maintaining personal power through dominance. Its principles recognizing that authentic authority required consent rather than submission, while providing mechanism for addressing conflicts between individual freedom and collective stability through shared consequence rather than forced compliance. "Ancient law that binds royal fate to rejected subjects' choice," the king explained with voice that carried both authority and something that might have been relief at finally applying justice that traditional power had long abandoned in favor of convenient control through systematic oppression, declaring that alpha authority that cannot inspire willing loyalty from omega courage deserves exile, alongside refusal that proves unworthiness of leadership that serves self rather than community. "But Your Majesty, pack law requires," Elder Marcus protested with desperation that reflected panic throughout court, as established order faced challenge through ancient principle that transformed individual resistance into test of royal character and leadership worthiness. Pack law recognizes bound choice as highest authority when Omega refuses sacred bond through principled objection that challenges alpha worthiness rather than mere rebellion against established order, King Therion replied, with legal knowledge that demonstrated preparation for exactly such moment when justice would demand choice between convenient power and authentic leadership. "And you choose exile alongside Omega, who rejected royal authority rather than maintaining throne that serves pack stability through traditional hierarchy?" Elder Marcus asked with voice that carried horror at royal decision that threatened everything establishment understood about necessary order and cosmic obligation. "I choose to prove leadership worthy of consent, rather than accepting authority maintained through coercion that serves powerful interests, while sacrificing vulnerable members to systematic oppression disguised as natural law and divine order." As implications continued expanding through chamber, where witnesses struggled to understand royal decision that challenged foundations of established power, while revealing ancient legal principle that had been suppressed through centuries of systematic hierarchy maintenance, Naira found herself confronting transformation of individual resistance into catalyst for testing whether authentic leaders could emerge from rejection of traditional authority. "Your Majesty," she said, with voice that carried both gratitude and concern about consequences that royal decision would create for pack stability and territorial security that required effective leadership despite flaws in traditional authority structures. "Your sacrifice serves justice but threatens innocent lives that depend upon royal protection. Innocent lives deserve leadership that serves rather than dominates, protects rather than controls, inspires rather than intimidates through systematic enforcement of hierarchical relationships that benefit powerful while oppressing vulnerable." King Therion replied with conviction that demonstrated understanding of authentic authority that traditional power had abandoned through focus on control rather than service. "But exile threatens your survival alongside mine, while providing no guarantee that ancient law will restore authentic leadership to territory that requires effective governance, despite rejection of current authority through principled resistance to unjust ceremony. Ancient law provides mechanism for testing worthiness through shared consequence that either proves leadership capable of earning genuine loyalty or confirms that authority maintained through coercion deserves replacement through emergence of authentic governance that serves community welfare rather than protecting establishment interests." As royal decision crystallized into practical preparation for departure that would transform both their lives through application of ancient principle that challenged everything pack tradition understood about necessary hierarchy and inevitable submission. Guards began gathering supplies while courts struggled to process implications of legal revolution that individual resistance had triggered the rough courage to refuse chains despite deadly consequences. The Omega girl who had chosen exile over comfortable slavery had discovered that Alpha King possessed understanding of justice that traditional authority had concealed beneath systematic oppression, while royal decision to invoke ancient law revealed that authentic leadership required consent rather than submission through relationships that honored both strength and vulnerability rather than demanding systematic sacrifice of individual dignity for establishment convenience. Looking toward King Therion as he completed practical arrangements for departure that would either prove ancient law capable of restoring justice or confirm that traditional authority served establishment interests rather than community welfare through systematic oppression disguised as natural order, Naira realized that her choice had revealed more than personal courage. It had exposed fundamental questions about power and responsibility that pack tradition had avoided through convenient hierarchy that protected powerful while sacrificing vulnerable to maintenance of stable oppression. Tomorrow, they would enter wilderness together as exiles, whose survival would depend upon cooperation rather than dominance, mutual respect rather than systematic submission, authentic relationship rather than mystical bonds that transformed love into obligation through supernatural enforcement of hierarchical power that served establishment rather than souls who deserved freedom to choose connect. Ion based on genuine compatibility rather than traditional coercion. The Omega who refused chains had learned that Alpha King possessed wisdom to recognize authentic authority required consent, while royal decision to choose justice over convenient power would test whether ancient law could restore leadership that served community welfare rather than protecting traditional hierarchy through systematic oppression that sacrificed individual dignity for establishment. Stability and convenience. Dawn broke over wilderness that stretched endlessly beyond territorial boundaries, its untamed landscape offering freedom that came with constant danger for those who ventured beyond pack protection, without adequate preparation for survival challenges that tested every assumption about strength, resourcefulness, and cooperation required for maintaining life in an environment that recognized no hierarchy beyond natural law and practical necessity. Naira woke to sound of careful movement as King Therion. No longer king, she reminded herself, but fellow exile whose survival depended upon same skills and determination that would determine her own fate in wilderness, that cared nothing for former titles or traditional authority, prepared morning meal from supplies they had gathered during first week of exile that had taught them both harsh lessons about practical requirements for continued existence. "Good morning," she said, with voice that carried warmth, despite circumstances that made each day uncertain survival test, requiring constant attention to practical necessities that luxury and royal household staff had previously managed without their direct involvement or understanding of complexity involved in basic maintenance of life. "Morning, Naira," he replied, with use of personal name that emphasized equality their exile had established, despite former relationship that had been defined through hierarchical authority and traditional power structures, rather than mutual respect and cooperation that wilderness demanded for successful navigation of challenges that threatened anyone insufficiently prepared for reality beyond territorial protection. What did the scouting reveal about route options for reaching neutral territory where exile might transform into refuge, rather than systematic struggle for survival in an environment that offers no guarantee about long-term sustainability without adequate resources and territorial authority? 1. Options that require choosing between speed, that risks exposure to pursuit by those who oppose royal decision to invoke ancient law, and caution that reduces discovery risk while extending time in wilderness that tests survival capabilities through extended exposure to elements and predators. And your assessment of pursuit likelihood given political chaos that royal departure must have created for pack governance and territorial administration that requires immediate attention regardless of personal feelings about justice versus traditional authority maintenance? Assessment that pursuit remains likely despite immediate governance challenges, given establishment interest in restoring traditional hierarchy, rather than allowing ancient law precedent to inspire similar challenges throughout territory that could threaten systematic power structures through widespread resistance to established order. The practical analysis emphasized ongoing danger that made their exile more than simple departure from pack territory into neutral wilderness, transforming survival challenge into political necessity that required constant vigilance against enemies whose interest extended beyond personal revenge to systematic protection of established authority through elimination of threat that successful exile represented to traditional power maintenance. As they prepared for days' journey toward distant sanctuary that might offer refuge if reached before pursuit could intercept their progress through wilderness that provided both concealment and exposure, depending upon terrain and weather conditions that constantly shifted tactical advantages between hunter and hunted, conversation turned toward fundamental questions about authority and resistance, that their circumstances had revealed. "Therion," Naira said with continued use of personal name that acknowledged transformation of their relationship from hierarchical authority to partnership based on mutual necessity and shared commitment to survival through cooperation rather than dominance. "What made you choose ancient law over traditional authority when such choice threatened everything your position provided?" Recognition that authority maintained through coercion serves establishment interests rather than community welfare, while leadership that requires forced compliance lacks legitimacy, that authentic governance demands for serving souls rather than controlling bodies through systematic oppression, disguised as natural order. But such recognition must have developed through experience that challenged traditional assumptions about necessary hierarchy and inevitable submission, that pack education emphasized through systematic instruction about cosmic order and divine authority that justified established power structures. Experience that included observation of resistance movements in conquered territories where traditional authority had failed to inspire genuine loyalty, requiring increasingly harsh enforcement that demonstrated weakness rather than strength, while revealing that sustainable governance required consent rather than mere submission to power, maintained through intimidation. And such observation led to understanding that pack governance suffered similar legitimacy problems, despite appearance of stability through systematic hierarchy maintenance. Understanding that stability built upon oppression serves those who benefit from injustice, rather than creating authentic harmony that honors both strength and gentleness through relationships based on mutual respect, rather than forced compliance with traditional power structures that protect establishment interests while sacrificing vulnerable members. The philosophical discussion revealed depth of analysis that traditional royal education had apparently failed to suppress, despite systematic instruction designed to maintain established hierarchy through acceptance of conventional wisdom about necessary authority and inevitable submission to cosmic order that justified systematic oppression as natural law. So your decision to invoke ancient law represented culmination of growing understanding about authentic leadership rather than impulsive response to unprecedented challenge to royal authority. Decision that represented choice between continuing to serve establishment interests through systematic oppression disguised as natural hierarchy, or accepting responsibility for testing whether authentic governance could emerge through application of principles that honored individual dignity while maintaining community welfare through cooperation rather than coercion. And what expectations do you have regarding outcome of such test, given wilderness exile that provides no guarantee about survival or eventual return to governance role that could implement authentic authority based on consent rather than traditional dominance? Expectations that focus on proving worthiness for leadership through survival, that demonstrates practical competence while developing understanding of cooperation that serves mutual welfare rather than hierarchical power maintenance that protected establishment through systematic sacrifice of individual dignity and freedom. As conversation continued revealing philosophical framework that guided royal decision to abandon traditional authority in favor of testing ancient principles that challenged established order, practical necessities of wilderness survival demanded attention to immediate requirements for continued existence through terrain that offered both opportunities and threats depending upon their ability. Recognize and respond appropriately to environmental challenges. The morning's travel proceeded through forests that provided concealment while requiring careful navigation to avoid hazards that could trap or injure anyone insufficiently familiar with wilderness survival techniques that pack education had never emphasized, given assumption that territorial authority provided adequate protection for all members through established hierarchy and military organization. Ion. Movement ahead, Therion announced, with voice that carried alertness rather than alarm, despite recognition that discovery could represent either neutral encounter with other travelers or hostile contact with pursuit forces, whose mission included prevention of successful exile that could inspire similar challenges to traditional authority throughout territory. Assessment of threat level and recommended response strategy, Naira asked with practical focus that demonstrated adaptation to circumstances that required constant vigilance and strategic thinking, rather than reliance upon others' protection through hierarchical authority that was no longer available for addressing challenges. Unknown composition and intention, though positioning suggests deliberate interception rather than coincidental encounter with random travelers who pose minimal threat to exile progress toward neutral territory. And recommendations for addressing potential hostile contact, given our limited defensive capability and uncertain terrain advantages that could support successful evasion rather than direct confrontation. Strategic withdrawal to elevated position that provides observation advantage while maintaining escape routes, if negotiation proves impossible and combat becomes necessary for continued survival and exile progress. As they moved carefully toward defensive position that offered tactical advantage while preserving options for either communication or retreat, depending upon hostile intentions that approaching movement might represent. Sounds of pursuit became clearer through forest that amplified noise while concealing visual contact until proximity forced revelation of either friend or enemy. Royal Guard formation, Therion identified with recognition that confirmed their fears about organized pursuit, whose mission included restoration of traditional authority through elimination of threat that successful ancient law application represented to established hierarchy maintenance throughout territorial system. Captain Sterling? Naira asked with hope that pursuit might include reasonable leadership willing to consider negotiation, rather than immediate enforcement of establishment interests through violent restoration of traditional order that served powerful rather than authentic justice. Captain Sterling leading force of 12 guards whose mission parameters remain unknown, though positioning suggests hostile rather than diplomatic intentions, given tactical formation that emphasizes combat readiness over communication opportunity. So we face choice between surrender that returns us to ceremonial binding and traditional authority, or resistance that risks death while preserving principle that individual dignity deserves protection from systematic oppression disguised as natural law. A choice that tests whether courage to refuse chains can inspire authentic resistance to establishment interests or merely provides noble gesture before inevitable defeat through superior force that serves traditional hierarchy maintenance rather than justice that honors both strength and vulnerability equally. As pursuit force approached position where confrontation could no longer be avoided through tactical withdrawal, moment arrived that would determine whether ancient law possessed practical power to protect those who chose principle over convenience, or represented merely theoretical ideal that establishment interests could suppress through conventional force application. Nira Vale. King Therion! Captain Sterling's voice carried across forest clearing with authority that demanded attention, despite exile status that should have freed them from obligations to respond to royal guard commands that served establishment rather than justice. By order of Elder Council, you will return immediately for restoration of proper authority and correction of illegal application of ancient law. Ancient law remains valid, despite establishment preference for traditional hierarchy. Therion replied, with voice that carried former royal authority, despite changed circumstances that made such authority largely theoretical rather than practical, given their vulnerable position facing superior force with hostile intentions. Ancient law has been declared invalid through proper council authority. Resistance will be met with force necessary for restoring territorial stability and appropriate governance. Council lacks authority to invalidate law that supersedes establishment convenience through cosmic principle that tests leadership worthiness rather than protecting traditional power structures that serve oppression rather than authentic community welfare. As verbal confrontation continued revealing fundamental conflict between ancient principle and establishment interests, tactical situation deteriorated toward inevitable violence unless negotiation could produce alternative that preserved both principle and survival through compromise that honored justice, while acknowledging practical limitations that individual resistance faced when confronting systematic power. Final warning! Captain Sterling announced with tone that emphasized immediate compliance or violent enforcement that would serve traditional hierarchy through elimination of threat that successful exile represented to established order. Surrender now or face consequences that resistance demands. We choose principle over convenience, justice over establishment interests, authentic authority over systematic oppression, Naira declared, with voice that carried conviction, despite recognition that such conviction might cost their lives, while serving broader truth about individual dignity and freedom that no amount of traditional authority could legitimately suppress. Then face consequences of defying proper order, Captain Sterling commanded, as guards moved forward with weapons drawn to enforce establishment interests through violence that traditional authority employed when persuasion failed to maintain hierarchical power structures. But as confrontation approached climax, that would either confirm establishment power or prove ancient law possessed practical authority to protect those who chose principle over convenience, unexpected development transformed tactical situation through revelation that resistance to injustice could inspire others beyond individual courage to refuse systematic oppression that served powerful STS rather than community welfare. "Stand down, Captain Sterling," new voice commanded from Forest Edge, where additional figures emerged to reveal support that exile had inspired among those who recognized authentic principle when establishment interests faced challenge through ancient law application that honored individual dignity rather than protecting traditional hierarchy. "By what authority do you interfere with proper council orders?" Captain Sterling demanded with anger that reflected establishment frustration when systematic power faced unexpected resistance through support networks that traditional authority had failed to anticipate or prepare adequate response for addressing. By authority of ancient law that recognizes authentic leadership through consent rather than coercion, justice rather than convenience, principle rather than establishment interest, maintenance that serves powerful while sacrificing vulnerable to systematic oppression disguised as natural order. As support revealed itself through emergence of dozen allies whose presence transformed tactical situation from hopeless resistance to balanced confrontation, where outcome would depend upon negotiation rather than inevitable defeat through superior force, Naira realized that her choice to refuse chains had inspired recognition of principles that traditional authority had systematically suppressed, but never completely eliminated from territorial consciousness. The Omega girl who had chosen exile over comfortable slavery had discovered that Alpha King possessed wisdom to invoke ancient law, while royal decision to abandon traditional authority had revealed that authentic resistance to establishment interests could inspire support networks that challenge systematic oppression through practical application of justice that honored individual dignity alongside community welfare requirements. Looking toward Therion as tactical balance shifted toward possibility of successful negotiation rather than violent suppression of principle through establishment force, Naira understood that their exile had become catalyst for testing whether ancient law possessed power to restore authentic governance, or would face defeat through systematic resistance that traditional authority maintained for protecting hierarchical power structures against challenge from justice that served souls rather than establishment convenience. The confrontation in Forest Clearing had evolved into tense negotiation, as Captain Sterling found himself facing not merely two exiles whose resistance could be easily suppressed, but organized movement whose support challenged fundamental assumptions about territorial loyalty and establishment authority that traditional governance had assumed would remain stable, despite increasing evidence of systematic dissatisfaction with hierarchical oppression. "Captain," spoke Vera Thornwick, former Beta of Eastern Pack, whose presence among supporters revealed that opposition to current authority extended beyond individual resistance to include experienced leadership capable of coordinating alternative governance that could threaten establishment interests through practical application of authentic principles. Ancient law demands recognition regardless of council preferences. Council authority supersedes individual interpretation of obsolete legal principles that threaten territorial stability, Captain Sterling replied, with voice that carried uncertainty despite official position that demanded enforcement of establishment directives regardless of personal feelings about justice or ancient law validity. Obsolete law that was never formally repealed through proper legal procedure, making council declaration invalid according to territorial constitution that establishes legal hierarchy recognizing ancient principles as foundational authority that cannot be dismissed through administrative convenience, Vera countered, with legal expertise that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of government structure. Constitutional authority rests with current council rather than ancient precedent that serves individual convenience over territorial welfare, Captain Sterling argued, with position that reflected establishment training about necessary hierarchy, despite obvious discomfort with confronting organized resistance that included respected leadership figures. Constitutional authority derives from ancient law that established territorial governance through consent rather than coercion, making council authority dependent upon adherence to foundational principles rather than administrative power to override inconvenient legal precedent through declaration that lacks proper constitutional foundation. As legal debate continued revealing complexity of governmental structure that traditional authority had simplified through emphasis on hierarchical obedience rather than constitutional law that protected individual rights through ancient principles, tactical situation remained balanced between negotiated resolution and violent confrontation that would serve neither establishment nor resistance interests effectively. What resolution do you propose that acknowledges both ancient law validity and territorial stability requirements? Therion asked, with voice that sought practical compromise, despite personal commitment to principle that had inspired royal decision to invoke ancient law, rather than accepting convenient authority maintenance through systematic oppression. Resolution that recognizes ancient law application while providing mechanism for addressing governance transition that serves territorial welfare, rather than merely protecting establishment interests through violent suppression of legitimate legal challenge to current authority. Vera replied with diplomatic approach that balanced principle with practical necessity. And what specific mechanism would provide such governance transition without creating chaos that threatens innocent lives, dependent upon stable administration for territorial protection and essential services that organized government provides? And mechanism that establishes constitutional convention for reviewing governmental structure according to ancient principles while maintaining interim authority through cooperative arrangement between current establishment and resistance leadership that honors both stability requirements and justice demands. The proposal offered framework for addressing fundamental conflict between ancient law and current authority through democratic process that could either restore authentic governance based on consent or confirm establishment legitimacy through proper evaluation according to constitutional principles rather than administrative convenience or violent suppression. Captain Sterling, Therion said, with voice that carried former royal authority despite changed circumstances that made such authority largely symbolic rather than practical. What instructions did Council provide regarding negotiated resolution versus violent enforcement if resistance proved more organized than individual defiance? Instructions that emphasized restoration of proper authority through whatever means proved necessary for maintaining territorial stability, Captain Sterling replied, with careful phrasing that avoided specific commitment to violence, while acknowledging establishment preference for traditional hierarchy maintenance over accommodation to ancient law challenges, and personal assessment of whether violent suppression serves territorial stability when resistance includes respected leadership whose opposition suggests broader dissatisfaction with current governance rather than isolated criminal defiance of proper authority. Personal assessment that territorial welfare requires careful consideration of all factors affecting long-term stability rather than immediate enforcement that might create larger problems through suppression of legitimate concerns about governmental accountability and constitutional adherence to foundational principles. The acknowledgement revealed that even establishment enforcement recognized complexity of situation that extended beyond simple restoration of traditional authority to include fundamental questions about governmental legitimacy and constitutional law that violent suppression could not resolve effectively. Then we propose temporary truce for constitutional convention that evaluates ancient law validity while maintaining current governance for essential services, Vera announced with diplomatic framework that offered both sides opportunity to pursue objectives through legal process rather than confrontation that threatened everyone's welfare, regardless of ultimate outcome. Truce duration and convention parameters that ensure fair evaluation rather than predetermined outcome, serving either establishment or resistance interests exclusively, Captain Sterling asked, with professional focus on practical details that implementation would require for successful negotiation rather than continued confrontation. 6-month convention period with equal representation between current authority and ancient law advocates, evaluation conducted according to historical precedent and constitutional law rather than political convenience, with implementation of results binding upon all parties regardless of personal preferences about outcome, and interim governance arrangements that maintain essential services while preventing either establishment or resistance from gaining unfair advantage during evaluation period. Cooperative administration with shared responsibility for territorial welfare. Current council maintaining executive authority, while ancient law advocates provide oversight, ensuring constitutional compliance. All major decisions requiring mutual agreement that serves territorial interests rather than factional advantage. As negotiation framework developed toward practical agreement that could serve both principle and stability while avoiding violent confrontation that would threaten innocent lives regardless of ultimate outcome, Captain Sterling found himself confronting choice between rigid enforcement of establishment directives and reasonable accommodation to circumstances that required diplomatic solution rather than military suppression. I lack authority to approve such arrangement without council consultation, he admitted with honesty, that acknowledged limitations of field command, despite obvious merit of negotiated resolution over violent confrontation that could escalate beyond anyone's ability to control effectively. Then we propose immediate return to territorial boundaries for council presentation, while maintaining truce that protects all parties during negotiation period, Vera suggested with practical approach that addressed authority limitations while preserving progress toward peaceful resolution that served everyone's legitimate interests. Return under what security arrangements that ensure safety for exiles while providing counsel with confidence that Constitutional Convention proposal represents good faith negotiation rather than tactical maneuver for avoiding consequences of defying proper authority. Return under joint escort with both establishment and resistance representatives providing security. All parties committed to preventing violence while constitutional evaluation proceeds according to agreed framework that honors both ancient law principles and current governance requirements. 6 months later, the Constitutional Convention had transformed territorial governance through systematic evaluation of ancient law that revealed foundational principles requiring consent rather than coercion for legitimate authority, while current establishment had demonstrated adaptation to constitutional requirements through cooperative administration that served territorial welfare. More effectively than traditional hierarchy maintenance, Nira stood in Great Hall that had been site of her original refusal to accept chains, now witnessing ceremony that would either restore ancient law authority or confirm establishment legitimacy through proper constitutional evaluation that honored both principle and practical necessity for effective governance that served souls rather than controlling bodies through systematic oppression. The convention concludes, announced Chief Magistrate Aldrich, neutral authority whose evaluation had revealed that ancient law possessed valid constitutional foundation, requiring recognition despite establishment preferences for traditional hierarchy, that bound choice represents authentic legal principle, deserving restoration to territorial law as mechanism for testing leadership worthiness through consent rather than coercion. Furthermore, he continued with voice that carried weight of comprehensive legal analysis, current governance structure lacks constitutional foundation for authority, maintained through systematic oppression rather than consent, that ancient law demanded for legitimate leadership that serves community welfare rather than establishment interests exclusively. However, evaluation recognizes that effective governance requires practical authority for territorial administration, leading to recommendation for constitutional monarchy that balances ancient law principles with administrative necessity through cooperative structure that honors both individual dignity and collective welfare requirements. The solution offered framework that satisfied both ancient law demands for consent-based authority and practical necessity for effective governance through institutional structure that could evolve according to constitutional principles rather than administrative convenience or traditional hierarchy maintenance that served powerful interests while sacrificing vulnerable members. Therian Blackvein, Chief Magistrate Aldrich announced with formal authority that carried weight of constitutional evaluation, Convention recognizes ancient law application as legitimate exercise of legal authority, recommending restoration to constitutional monarchy with powers limited by requirement for consent that bound choice provides as mechanism for testing continued worthiness for leadership responsibility. Nira Vale, he continued with recognition that individual resistance had inspired constitutional evaluation that served territorial welfare. Convention acknowledges courage to invoke ancient law as service to constitutional principle, recommending elevation to constitutional advisor, whose responsibility includes oversight ensuring governmental adherence to foundational principles that honor individual dignity alongside collective necessity, and all territorial residents. Chief Magistrate concluded with broad application of constitutional principle, receive recognition of bound choice right that protects individual consent in relationship formation while maintaining community stability through legal framework that serves authentic connection rather than systematic coercion disguised as natural law or divine authority. As ceremony concluded with establishment of constitutional government that balanced ancient law principles with practical governance requirements through institutional structure that honored both strength and vulnerability, Therian approached Nira with recognition that their exile had achieved more than personal freedom. It had restored authentic authority to territory that had suffered under establishment oppression disguised as necessary hierarchy. Constitutional Advisor Vale, he said with voice that carried respect for elevation, earned through courage rather than inherited through traditional advantage. What assessment do you offer regarding constitutional implementation that serves both principle and practical governance requirements? Assessment that authentic authority requires ongoing commitment to consent rather than assuming legitimacy through constitutional structure, making continued worthiness dependent upon service that honors individual dignity while maintaining collective welfare through cooperation that strengthens rather than oppresses community members. And personal thoughts regarding constitutional monarchy that balances ancient law principles with practical governance through limitation that requires consent for continued authority. Personal satisfaction that chains have been broken not just for individuals, but for system that oppressed souls through hierarchy that served powerful interests, while constitutional structure provides framework for governance that can evolve according to justice, rather than remaining frozen in traditional patterns that protected establishment while sacrificing vulnerable members to convenient stability. As constitutional government began operation through cooperative structure that honored both ancient law principles and practical necessity, territorial administration demonstrated effectiveness that exceeded traditional hierarchy through voluntary cooperation that served collective welfare while protecting individual dignity that systematic oppression had threatened through coercive relationship. Maintenance disguised as natural order. 2 years later, the Territorial Assembly Hall buzzed with energy as citizens gathered for annual constitutional review that evaluated governmental performance according to ancient law principles while addressing practical challenges that effective governance faced through democratic participation that honored both individual voice and collective wisdom accumulated through experience with cooperate. Administration. NIRA reviewed reports that demonstrated territorial prosperity through governance based on consent rather than coercion, voluntary cooperation rather than forced compliance, mutual respect rather than hierarchical dominance that had characterized establishment authority, before constitutional evaluation, restored authentic principles that served souls rather than controlling bodies through systematic oppression. Economic indicators showed improvement through cooperative labor that honored individual contribution while serving collective welfare. Social stability had increased through relationship formation based on genuine compatibility, rather than mystical bonds enforced through supernatural coercion. Territorial defense had strengthened through voluntary service that inspired dedication rather than wearing reluctant compliance with hierarchical authority. Constitutional advisor approached Minister Garrett with practical concern that required attention despite overall success of constitutional governance. Border territories report interest in similar constitutional evaluation, requesting guidance for implementing ancient law principles without disrupting essential services during governmental transition. Excellent development, NIRA replied with satisfaction. The constitutional success was inspiring broader movement toward authentic governance that honored individual dignity while maintaining collective welfare through cooperation rather than systematic oppression that traditional authority employed for establishment benefit. What specific guidance would serve their constitutional evaluation effectively? Guidance regarding balance between principle and practical necessity, framework for peaceful transition that avoids confrontation while achieving authentic authority based on consent rather than coercion, legal precedent that demonstrates constitutional validity for ancient law application, despite establishment resistance to governmental accountability. Such guidance should emphasize that constitutional evaluation serves territorial welfare through restoration of authentic authority, rather than threatening stability, while providing practical framework for transition that honors both ancient principles and administrative necessity through cooperative structure that protects everyone's legitimate interests. As constitutional government continued demonstrating effectiveness through governance based on consent rather than coercion, voluntary cooperation rather than forced compliance, mutual respect rather than hierarchical dominance, territorial success inspired broader movement toward authentic authority that challenged systematic oppression throughout region where traditional establishment had maintained power through convenient hierarchy that served powerful interests while sacrificing vulnerable members. The Omega girl who had chosen exile over chains had discovered that individual resistance could inspire constitutional evaluation that restored authentic governance to territory that deserved leadership based on consent rather than coercion, while Alpha King, who abandoned traditional authority to invoke ancient law, had proven that true strength served justice rather than protecting establishment. Interest through systematic oppression disguised as necessary hierarchy. Looking toward Therion as he conducted constitutional assembly with authority that had been earned through service rather than inherited through traditional advantage, Nera recognized that their exile had achieved transformation that exceeded personal freedom. It had restored authentic governance that honored both individual dignity and collective welfare through constitutional structure that could de-evolve according to justice rather than remaining frozen in patterns that protected powerful while oppressing vulnerable souls. The chains she had refused to accept had been broken not just for herself, but for an entire system that had bound souls through hierarchical relationships that served establishment convenience rather than authentic connection based on genuine compatibility and mutual respect that constitutional government now protected through legal framework that honored both strength and vulnerability equally. Constitutional monarchy had proven that authentic authority could balance ancient principles with practical necessity through cooperative structure that served territorial welfare while protecting individual dignity from systematic oppression that traditional hierarchy had employed for maintaining convenient power that benefited establishment at expense of vulnerable members whose welfare deserve the equal consideration and protection. The Alpha King, who had shattered his crown instead of breaking her chains, had discovered that true strength lay in service rather than domination, cooperation rather than control, inspiration rather than intimidation through governance that earned consent rather than demanding submission from souls who deserved freedom to choose authentic relationships based on genuine connection rather than missed. Equal bonds enforced through supernatural coercion disguised as cosmic law. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.